लाइफ में लेना देना तो चलता रहता है। इधर फ्लेक्सी लोन से बोरो कर लिया और उधर बाय मॉम डैड का वेकेशन डन। शादी का डिसीजन लिया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से और बोरो किया। प्रमोशन मिला तो ये लो थोड़ा लोन वापस कर दिया, थैंक यू। नए इंटीरियर्स का दिल किया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से फिर थोड़ा ले लिया। ईयर एंड बोनस मिला तो इस बार लोन ज्यादा वापस कर दिया। लाइफ में लेना देना चलता रहेगा तो लोन्स में क्यों नहीं। इसीलिए फ्लेक्सी लोन फ्रॉम बजाज फिनसर्व एक ऐसा लोन जो जब चाहे बोरो करे, जैसे चाहे रीपे करे, वो भी चुटकी में। थिंक इट डन विद बजाज फिनसर्व।
हेलो, हर सीजन के लिए नए इंटीरियर्स।
हाँ, वो भी हर रूम के लिए।
फ्रिज, स्मार्टफोन या बड़ा टीवी,
तीनों क्यों नहीं?
अरे ये तो शॉपिंग लिस्ट में नहीं था।
सो अब शॉपिंग कार्ट में तो है। सॉरी।
अच्छा, नए आउटफिट्स की विश लिस्ट।
विश क्यों? जस्ट ऐड टू कार्ट एंड बाय।
तो ये सब EMI पे,
और वो भी चुटकी में। ऑन इंडियाज फास्टेस्ट ग्रोइंग EMI नेटवर्क। थिंक इट डन विद बजाज फिनसर्व।
सर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। साहब, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। हुजूर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता।
अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान।
अपनों को खुशियां दिलाना आसान नहीं बनाते तो आगे कैसे बढ़ते। इसीलिए हम जो भी करते हैं उसे बेहतर बनाते आ रहे हैं, बनाते रहेंगे। बजाज फिनसर्व, थिंक इट डन।
माँ के बेडरूम का एसी या लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई। पुणे, पटना, चेन्नई, मथुरा या फिर बेगूसराय, या फिर बेगूसराय। नए घर के लिए चाहिए 4K टीवी हाई फाई, या फिर वाइफ को चाहिए लेटेस्ट स्टाइल। EMI है ना, EMI है ना, EMI। मॉड्यूलर किचन में पुराना फ्रिज क्यों है भाई?
शादी है नहीं, मैट्रेस पुराना है भाई। अक्खा इंडिया बोले भाई प्राइजेस है हाई। बेस्ट ही खरीदना है तो अपने EMI स्टोर पर आए।
EMI है ना, EMI।
अब काशी हो या वाशी, महंगा लगी तो EMI और बेस्ट ही चाहिए तो भी EMI, क्योंकि बजाज फिनसर्व का EMI है ना। विजिट www.emistore.com।
EMI है ना, EMI है ना, EMI।
नाची 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 नाची। धोखा है धोखा, धोखा ना खाओ जी। नाची 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 नाची। इंश्योरेंस फ्रॉड से बचना है बहुत जरूरी जी। नाची 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 नाची। वो एजेंट है या फ्रॉड पता लगाओ जी। एक्स्ट्रा ऑफर के झांसे में कहीं फंस ना जाओ जी।
अगर कोई अनजान कॉलर इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी डिटेल्स मांगे तो कह देना उनको
मिलके स्कैम को एंड करो, हमेशा सेफ रहो जी।
Always verify the caller and do not surrender your insurance for attractive offers. हमेशा सावधान रहे, safe रहे. Issued in the interest of public awareness by Bajaj Finserv.
नाची 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 नाची। धोखा है धोखा, धोखा ना खाओ जी। नाची 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 नाची। जो होगा सो होगा ऐसे ना सोचो जी।
कह देना उनको। मिलके स्कैम को एंड करो, हमेशा सेफ रहो जी।
Being a hero is all about heart. It's not about ruling the world. It's about owning it. It's not about winning a race. It's about delivering a smile to the human race. It's about a spirit that just cannot be confined by geographies. It's about the heart that beats for the future and a soul that echoes the values of generations. And yet, being a hero is never about the hero. It's about the millions who celebrate them. Hero Motorcorp, the motorcycle leader. There's a gush of wind that hums a sweet song. There's a gush of wind that fights like a hero to fill the world with possibility. There's a gush of wind that jumps across oceans and mountains, embracing the entire planet. There's a gush of wind that blows away darkness. There's a gush of wind that blows for humanity. Because at Hero, we care.
In 1868, the Tata Group was founded on a philosophy that put the community at the heart of its existence. Today, we are $100 billion global enterprise. Our today has been built on enduring values. Today is about delivering excellence across business sectors. Is about building a future-ready nation. Our today has a strong foundation with community at its core. Our today is dedicated to the communities we serve. today is always about more than just a day. Our today is a continuous journey for a better tomorrow. Tata. Leadership with trust.
Behold, the story of victory, of life over malady. Behold the saga of power, of science over sickness. Behold the tale of triumph, of dedication over disease. Behold the rise and rise of Cadillac Pharmaceuticals Limited, one of India's largest privately held pharmaceutical companies based out of Ahmedabad, Gujarat, India. Cadillac Pharmaceuticals was born out of the vision of a legend who left an indelible mark in the chronicles of Indian pharmaceuticals industry. He was Indravadan Ambalal Modi, the founder chairman of the company, rightfully christened as the Medicine Man of India. His vision to alleviate pain of the underprivileged through research-driven innovations has been driving Cadillac Pharmaceuticals for more than 6 decades now. Innovations which are backed by the key strengths of the company, the state-of-the-art manufacturing and research facilities. The flagship manufacturing facility at Dholka, Gujarat, sprawls over 100 acres. This avant-garde facility is US FDA approved, besides meeting most of the stringent quality standards across the globe. It manufactures tablets, capsules, injectables, liquids, and orals. The second formulations manufacturing facility is located at Samba in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. The API facilities at Ankleshwar, Gujarat, manufacture a large number of key APIs and intermediates at this US FDA and ISO 9002 and ISO 14001 accredited plant. The company also has set up its first ever overseas formulation manufacturing facility at Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. This world-class facility is the only WHO CGMP compliant manufacturing facility in the region. More than 850 products spread across 12 specialties with many of India's top brands in its basket. Great goals are defined by far-sighted vision and achieved by seamless teamwork. A multicultural, multilingual and multinational workforce of over 7,000 employees is truly the propelling power of the company. Not just in the domestic market, the company has a wide global footprint with over 1,000 marketing authorizations across 85 countries. Its international sales force of over 150 highly diversified and versatile personnel lends it an outreach that blankets the globe. As the company grows, so does its commitment to research. Manned by more than 350 scientists, the R&D facilities of Cadillac Pharmaceuticals at Dholka, Gujarat is an institution of breakthrough innovations. To take the focus on innovation to the next level, it partners with leading international companies to discover newer treatments. The Cadillac Pharmaceuticals Group is gigantic. Its group companies complement and expand the dynamic vision of the company across new avenues of healthcare and newer fast-paced business areas. Cadillac Pharmaceuticals is a gentle giant. Decades of dedicated research, groundbreaking healthcare innovations, and worldwide impact proves the infinite potential of one powerful emotion. Care. The success of Cadillac Pharmaceuticals bears testimony to the fact that the care continues.
आने वाले कल की दस्तक हमें सुनाई देती है, नई मंजिल है जिस ओर हमें वो दिशा दिखाई देती है। नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए जोश से निकल पड़े हम, आने वाला कल होगा हमारा, नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
और नए इंडिया के सफर में टेक्नोलॉजी की शक्ति लेकर आपका भागीदार रहेगा रिलायंस। नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
लाइफ में लेना देना तो चलता रहता है। इधर फ्लेक्सी लोन से बोरो कर लिया और उधर बाय मॉम डैड का वेकेशन डन। शादी का डिसीजन लिया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से और बोरो किया। प्रमोशन मिला तो ये लो थोड़ा लोन वापस कर दिया। थैंक यू। नए इंटीरियर्स का डील किया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से फिर थोड़ा ले लिया। ईयर एंड बोनस मिला तो इस बार लोन ज्यादा वापस कर दिया। लाइफ में लेना देना चलता रहेगा तो लोन्स में क्यों नहीं। इसीलिए फ्लेक्सी लोन फ्रॉम बजाज फिनसर्व एक ऐसा लोन जो जब चाहे बोरो करे, जैसे चाहे रीपे करे, वो भी चुटकी में। थिंक इट डन विद बजाज फिनसर्व।
हेलो, हर सीजन के लिए नए इंटीरियर्स?
हाँ, वो भी हर रूम के लिए।
फ्रिज, स्मार्टफोन या बड़ा टीवी?
तीनों क्यों नहीं?
अरे ये तो शॉपिंग लिस्ट में नहीं था।
सो अब शॉपिंग कार्ट में तो है। सॉरी।
अच्छा, नए आउटफिट्स की विश लिस्ट।
विश क्यों? जस्ट ऐड टू कार्ट एंड बाय।
तो ये सब EMI पे?
और वो भी चुटकी में। On India's fastest growing EMI network. Think it done with Bajaj Finserv.
सर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। साहब, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। हुजूर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता।
अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान।
अपनों को खुशियां दिलाना आसान नहीं बनाते तो आगे कैसे बढ़ते। इसीलिए हम जो भी करते हैं उसे बेहतर बनाते आ रहे हैं, बनाते रहेंगे। बजाज फिनसर्व, थिंक इट डन।
माँ के बेडरूम का एसी या लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई। पुणे, पटना, चेन्नई, मथुरा या फिर बेगूसराय,
या फिर बेगूसराय।
नए घर के लिए चाहिए 4K टीवी हाई फाई, या फिर वाइफ को चाहिए लेटेस्ट स्टाइल। EMI है ना, EMI है ना, EMI।
मॉड्यूलर किचन में पुराना फ्रिज क्यों है भाई?
शादी है नहीं, मैट्रेस पुराना है भाई। अक्खा इंडिया बोले भाई प्राइजेस है हाई, बेस्ट ही खरीदना है तो अपने EMI स्टोर पर आए।
EMI है ना, EMI।
अब काशी हो या वाशी, महंगा लगे तो EMI और बेस्ट ही चाहिए तो भी EMI, क्योंकि बजाज फिनसर्व का EMI है ना। विजिट www.emistore.com।
EMI है ना, EMI है ना, EMI।
नाची 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 नाची। धोखा है धोखा, धोखा ना खाओ जी। नाची 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 नाची। इंश्योरेंस फ्रॉड से बचना है बहुत जरूरी जी। नाची 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 नाची। वो एजेंट है या फ्रॉड पता लगाओ जी। एक्स्ट्रा ऑफर के झांसे में कहीं फंस ना जाओ जी।
अगर कोई अनजान कॉलर इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी डिटेल्स मांगे तो कह देना उनको।
नाची 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 नाची। मिलके स्कैम को एंड करो, हमेशा सेफ रहो जी।
Always verify the caller and do not surrender your insurance for attractive offers. हमेशा सावधान रहे, safe रहे. Issued in the interest of public awareness by Bajaj Finserv.
नाची 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 नाची। धोखा है धोखा, धोखा ना खाओ जी। नाची 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 नाची। जो होगा सो होगा, ऐसे ना सोचो जी। नाची 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 नाची। कॉल पे कोई पूछे OTP दो ना जी,
तो कह देना उनको।
नाची 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 नाची। मिलके स्कैम को एंड करो, हमेशा सेफ रहो जी।
Being a hero is all about heart. It's not about ruling the world. It's about owning it. It's not about winning a race. It's about delivering a smile to the human race. It's about a spirit that just cannot be confined by geographies. It's about the heart that beats for the future and a soul that echoes the values of generations. And yet, being a hero is never about the hero. It's about the millions who celebrate them. Hero Motorcorp, the motorcycle leader. There's a gush of wind that hums a sweet song. There's a gush of wind that fights like a hero to fill the world with possibility. There's a gush of wind that jumps across oceans and mountains, embracing the entire planet. There's a gush of wind that blows away darkness. There's a gush of wind that blows for humanity. Because at Hero, we care.
In 1868, the Tata Group was founded on a philosophy that put the community at the heart of its existence. Today, we are $100 billion global enterprise. Our today has been built on enduring values. Our today is about delivering excellence across business sectors. Our today is about building a future-ready nation. Our today has a strong foundation with community at its core. Our today.
You can say hello.
Absolutely, and happy to host you home for a drink or a meal or a coffee, whatever suits you. But that'll be very good. Yeah, it'll be our pleasure.
The only thing is, I'm not new to Delhi. See the parents, especially, I haven't seen them for a year. It all depends on their programs as well, unfortunately.
Where do they live in Delhi?
In Vasant Vihar.
My office is in Vasant Vihar.
Mr. Manjal, I think we're live already. So you can begin actually.
I don't see Piyush. Is he still here? He's got disconnected.
Yes, actually. When do you have an idea what's happening?
Yes, just let me check. Hold on.
He's back.
Got knocked off there for a second.
Okay.
No problem. So we'll start, huh?
Yes.
Piyush, we'll start. Yeah. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all those who are joining throughout the world, and my very namaskar to all of you. Very special welcome to the 27th edition of CII Partnership Summit 2021, and to this special session on a brave new world, pathways towards sustainable recovery, as a part of which we will have a very interesting discussion with Mr. Piyush Gupta, CEO, DBS Group, Singapore, on charting the costs for sustainable as well as resilient economic growth and development in the post-pandemic world, given the climate change is the next big challenge. It gives me great pleasure in welcoming Mr. Gupta, who is spearheading one of the leading financial services group in Asia and has been a strong proponent of promoting sustainability across business operations, with strong emphasis on building a circular global economy post the pandemic world. Having donned various hats, he serves as the vice chairman of Institute of International Finance, Washington, and is a member of the Bretton Woods Committee Advisory Council, as well as World Business Council for Sustainable Development Executive Committee member. Given his vast experience in the domain of building green economies without compromising on financial viability, we are bound to gain immensely from this session's deliberations. With continuing decline in the global COVID-19 case count, the world is gradually moving towards economic recovery, which is being bolstered by large-scale stimulus, investments in infrastructure, and increasing exports. The investor sentiment is strengthening further as governments are formulating more recovery plans and announcing economic stimulus measures. While these are welcome developments, as the economic activity is picking up, the need of the hour is to integrate climate change issues in policy recovery strategies and follow building back a better approach. Governments across the globe must reinvent the socio-economic fabric in a way that leads a green transition which brings multiple opportunities such as improved environmental quality, modernized industry and infrastructure, accelerated economic diversification, and new jobs, creating new jobs. To move towards a circular economy, the government must step up investments for supporting the climate actions suggested at the COP26, which made significant progress towards delivering the Paris Agreement goals of limiting global warming. This indicates the need to adopt a bottom-up approach involving business, investors, NGOs, and customers. The role of business is accomplishing these goals, given COP26 is being perceived as the business and finance COP and cannot be undermined. In this context, I would like to highlight a few ideas which can help building more environment-friendly economies. First, there should be result-based approach for key policy and institutional reform to accelerate climate action. Translating bold climate objectives into policies and investments will require strong cooperation between national governments and international institutions with well-coordinated strategies underlying defined outcomes. Second, we must be provided with green recovery programs as investments are required in all forms of capital, human, physical, natural, or social, to address structural weaknesses to promote greener growth. Third, to ensure sustainable recovery, policymakers must not lose sight on Sustainable Development Goals of 2030, which are the pathway of building resilience. Accomplishing SDGs are important to lay foundation for an all-inclusive, resilient, and sustainable future. Fourth, regional cooperation is required to enable countries to develop more universal and environment-friendly digital infrastructure, including the legal, regulatory reforms. Greater association will build resilience and mitigate the threat of an uneven economy recovery. Fifth, stakeholders must capitalize on enormous potential for the energy sector to create direct and indirect jobs by prioritizing renewable energy for investment, reskilling workers, who may be dislocated from sectors owing to COVID-19 will also provide employment opportunities. Economic stimulus packages which can lower carbon emissions while also transforming the countries for leadership in green economy over longer term are the need of the hour. Economies definitely are set to gain from the wide range of benefits of green recovery measures, including employment generation and greater energy efficiency. As this 27th edition of the Partnership Summit, it is a privilege for us to be joined by close to 200 speakers and from more than 40 countries, which include 20 overseas ministers, 7 Indian ministers, 25 global CXOs, and more than 100 heads of institution, leadership, experts around the world. The Partnership Summit 2021 will have 50 sessions spread over 3 days, including 7 country sessions, and will witness participation from delegates from over 100 countries and provide 50 participants at the virtual investment pavilion. So now moving on to our session today and to interesting conversations with Mr. Piyush Gupta. Mr. Piyush Gupta, COVID-19 has dealt a devastating hand in many countries and companies. The resurgence of variants of the virus further threatens the path of sustainable recovery. Could you share some of your thoughts on some key issues that we will need to confront over the next few years, especially pertaining to COVID-19 and other pandemics that may come in the future?
Abhimanyu, first of all, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be on this forum. After you reeled off how many countries, ministers, and everybody else is on it, I feel even more privileged. And thank you for your opening comments. I actually agree with and resonate with many of them. To your specific question, I mean, let me, I give it some thought. And I want to talk to, I think, 4 fundamental important things that have happened in the last couple of years, which are going to be quite seminal for the coming decade. And some of this relates obviously to the ESG sustainability agenda, but I'm going to come to that in a second. The first thing I want to point out is a shift in what I think of as the demand side of the equation. Everybody can see that what's happened in the last 2 years, the digital consumption has increased on steroids. I read somewhere that today almost 12 or 13% of global GDP is digitally consumed. And this has gone up meaningfully in the last 2 years. It is likely to go up even more substantively in the next few years. Now, this has got profound implication. Let me give you some examples. You take education. 2 years ago, nobody would have imagined that all of K-12 education, all of tertiary education for a year long could be consumed digitally. And nevertheless, that's what's happened to the world. You take medicine, people have been talking about telemedicine for a long period of time. In the last couple of years, the rate of telemedicine and teleconsumption went up to extraordinarily high levels. And this is true both for the pharma industry and specifically for the telemedical consumption industry as well, video on demand, etc. You take gaming, it's been going up dramatically, but in the last 2 years, this industry has taken a life of its own. In fact, if you ask me, the digital consumption related to blockchain, crypto, and metaverse is going to be one of the most defining aspects of the coming few years. And, it's going to change the way people interact, interface, and buy. And frankly, in my own industry, financial services, and it's something that you're familiar with, it's been a game changer. Whether you're old, whether you're poor, everybody's been able to figure out how to use the mobile phone to access financial services. And by the way, it's not just the individual. This extended to small and medium enterprises. They extended to large enterprises. This extended to the capacity to create digital infrastructures, whether it's logistical platforms, something we created in India, something we created in Singapore, digital supply chains. So I think that's one thing. We've got to recognize that this is a huge shift. And by the way, I think this has got tremendous consequence for a country like India, not just changing the distribution paradigm locally, but allowing India to actually lead and plug into digital infrastructures regionally and globally. So that's one. The second thing I want to point out is what I think of as the supply side. the other end of the equation. And there are the two obvious things to think about. One is less to do with the pandemics, more to do with general geopolitics. I think the shift in the supply chains, or the thinking about supply chains, is real. I'm not in the camp that thinks there's going to be a wholesale shift away from China overnight. It's not easy to do. At the same time, it's quite clear that the resiliency in supply chains has started mattering a lot more to people, just in case, not just in time. And therefore, what you are seeing is nearshoring, which means supply chains are shifting closer to large markets. That means there will continue to be a supply chain to cater to China, but equally there will be a large opportunity for supply chains catering to big countries like India. And that, when you couple it with Atmanirbhar Bharat, etc., it's some real opportunity to establish a manufacturing setup for the country. Ironically, at the other end of the supply chain, I think of the labor supply chain, the manpower supply chain. And that, frankly, I think is not going to deglobalize. I think it's going to globalize even more. And that's simply because we've all learned to work remotely. Everybody works from home. And when you can work from home, you can work from anywhere. And I think this is going to be tremendously consequential for India's technology and BPO sector as we go forward. We've got to be mindful of the fact that we have to allow free data flows. Our policies have got to allow easy access to info. But I think this shift in supply chain, the supply side, could be quite beneficial. The third area I think will be consequential is this whole idea of global interaction. You spoke about it, Amanyu, in your 5 comments you made. But I think it's quite clear. People often say, in the pandemic showed us one thing, that nobody's safe till everybody's safe. And that means that this comity of nations, the coming together of the global constituency of nations, is going to be critical. And therefore, I actually ironically believe for the first time after the Bretton Woods arrangements of the 70 years ago, there is going to have to be a tremendous rethink of how you create the right institutions, whether they're for healthcare, is WHO adequate for things like pandemics, but equally for things that are going to come on us. Climate is not a single country problem. Nature is not a single country problem. We're going to have to deal with this at scale across countries. Now, in that context, and especially when you think about the new rules for sustainability, I think large countries like India have a real role to play, to bring thought leadership, to be able to drive the agenda. Even at COP26, India had a very meaningful role to play. But as we go forward, I think there's an opportunity to do that. The best way to play the role is through good public-private partnership, not just a government and public sector driven, but a public-private partnership arrangement around it. And finally, the fourth thing I want to talk to is the stuff you were really teeing up, and that's really the sustainability agenda. Particularly the E and S of ESG have got a very sharp focus in the last 2 years. E, because of the clear realization that tail risks happen. I mean, the pandemic was a tail risk. It happened, and look at what it did to the world. Now, the climate and nature is not even a tail risk. We know it's coming. It's just a time frame question of when does it come to hit us. But the recognition that we have to start dealing with this is on us. The recognition that when we have a gun to our head, like in the pandemic, we can find the resources. Think about it. We have a $17–18 trillion of fiscal response, almost that much of monetary response. So there's 1/3 of global GDP to deal with the pandemic. Can we find those kinds of resources or more to deal with the climate and the green issues that are on us? I think push come to shove, we can. I think some of this will have to be in the Build Back Better kinds of plans. You can see it in the European Green Recovery Plan. You can see it in the Biden Build Back Better plan. In Singapore, we created a complete green plan for recovery. It does require dipping into government coffers. It does require a degree of deficit financing. It does require, again, the public-private sector coming together. But I think the focus and agenda around this is going to be important. And the last is the S part of ESG. I think quite clearly the societal imbalances, and especially the plight of the frontliners, the daily wage workers, it came to the forefront in every country. And therefore, shifting the policy framework to be able to create a better social safety net, to be able to use digital tools, etc., to reach out to the masses and the man on the street. In our case, greater financial inclusion, bringing people into the formal financial system. I think these are all things that we're going to have to take a new look at in the years to come. So it's actually quite broad-based and quite expansive. To me, the net take, however, is that for a country like India, these last 2 years can be seminal. I'm very bullish. I think the next decade can be India's decade. And leveraging on these 4 mega shifts I talked about, I think there's a significant opportunity for India to really be able to play a very different kind of role as we go forward.
So I couldn't agree more with you, Piyush. And when you talk about the demand side, digital adoption has taken a different level. I see my on a lighter vein, I see my mother now doing yoga classes on Zoom, who would not operate a computer before, right?
About that, yeah.
And this is happening today with so many thousands of people viewing different sessions today on Zoom, which has happened because of the digital adoption. And supply side, of course, I think a lot of capacities that need to be built, and there's a huge opportunity for India, Atmanirbhar, make in India. I think that's a real big theme which is coming into play. And globalization again is something, of course, as a country we really need to as a world we need to think through what are the challenges, climate change, soil, etc., and really figure out what is the uniform body. And I think COVID has actually brought all of us together as one, rather than separating us. Your last point on ESG is something which I'll now dwell and ask you a few questions. ESG is, of course, extremely important. Particularly, it's been a topic that has been given recent completion of COP26. It's clear sustainable pathway to recovery is on top of minds of many countries and companies. In fact, ESG is also attracting a lot of different funds, different pools of capital, which are where companies are going to raise capital. The first question they're asking some of these funds is, are you ESG compliant? Or these are the policies, are you complying with them? So from this perspective, both India and DBS have made commitments to help this agenda. So what are the commitments that DBS has made? And what do you think is the role? You spoke about private and public sector, but what do you think is the role between public and private sector actors that can play an advancement of the ESG agenda?
So everyone correctly said, I thought, India and the Honorable Prime Minister made waves in Glasgow by announcing the 2070 commitment. Nobody anticipated that. So it was a very bold move, a strong foot forward. We at DBS actually chose the same occasion to make a 2050 net zero commitment. One of the reasons that I had not made the commitment earlier is because I think this is easier said than done. I sometimes laugh. It's easy to make a commitment for 2050 because, not only me, but 4 generations of CEOs after me will have come and gone. But the key question is, what do you need to do as milestones along the way? And therefore, till I was pretty sure that I had line of sight to what we needed to do by 2025 and what we needed to do by 2030, I was reluctant to make those commitments. What we have now done is set some pretty clear milestones. So, for example, coal and thermal lending, which is a large part of our carbon footprint, we've been very specific on, how we're going to reduce exposure to coal. We already stopped lending to coal mines and coal projects as an example. And over time, between now and 2025, we will reduce our lending to anybody who deals with coal. And so we have further commitments to other sectors, high carbon intensity sectors by 2030. Now, why is this a challenge? I'll tell you the 3 big challenges. Number one, I think the challenge of taxonomy and measurement is a real challenge. Today, there's an alphabet soup of standards and ways of measuring. So nobody knows what we're counting. Nobody knows what needs to be measured. Nobody has the right tools to measure. Like many other companies, DBS started disclosing TCFD disclosures 3 years ago. And the reality is there's no comparability. Everybody uses a different benchmark and different ways of trying to capture and this thing of, what is carbon intensity, what needs to be captured and what not. Leave alone nature. Nature, the world hasn't even started. Our taxonomies are different. So that's one big element. Now, that's one thing which I think is making progress. The newly established Sustainability Standards Board and the agenda driven by public sector will help, but private sector needs to be closely engaged to make sure this taxonomy and the measurements are things which are pragmatic and practical. You don't want to be, completely working off an abstract idea. The second big question, which is even more challenging, is the question of transition. So here's the big point. We as a mankind and civilization have spent the last 150 years building an economy which is based on fossil fuels. There are trillions of dollars of extant infrastructure which exists. And to wish it away overnight and say, hey, overnight we're going to eliminate all this and disappear to a new kind of world is really not possible. In fact, for countries and countries in the South, developing countries, the reality is that these countries are going to have to continue to rely on thermal, coal, and fossil fuel energy for substantial numbers of years to come. And you need to do this to ensure the social living conditions and the improvement in the social dynamics, particularly for large parts of the population. So the truth is that we will have to transition from a brown world to a green world. And this transition is going to have very specific and clear transition pathways. How do you go from dark green to dark brown to light brown? How do you go from light brown to light green? And then how do you get to green? These transition pathways need to be agreed, understood, and then acted upon. Otherwise, you could wind up with with consequences and social ramifications which are not acceptable to many countries. There's a lady called Kate Raworth in Oxford who tries to define this. You talk about the SDGs. She's actually done a really good job in defining something she calls donut economics. And the way the donut economics works is the outside ring of the donut represents the planetary boundaries. We need to be within the ozone layer. We need to be within the chemical layer. We need to be within the magnesium-potassium layer. But the inner ring of the donut represents the social floors. We need to make sure our people are out of poverty. We need to make sure people are out of hunger. We need to make sure that education standards are met. Now, sometimes the SDGs are in conflict. They're not complementary. How do you make sure that you cater to the inner ring while not getting outside the outer ring? It requires a transition methodology. For this, countries and governments have to set a standard, and private sector has got to be a part of agreeing to that. To me, setting the transition pathway is important, and getting global agreement that this is the way forward is important. This means, for example, as a bank, I could continue to finance fossil fuel because that's the only way to get the transition done. Today, I do transition financing. I finance some companies which, for example, put scrubbers on ships to take care of the dirty fuel. The evangelist would argue, why are you still financing ships? The non-evangelist would say that's the only way to move from brown to green. So I think that's something that we need to do collectively to make sure that we're pragmatic. The third thing to talk about, though, is that it does need some catalyzing in many ways by the governments. The regulatory frameworks are important, and incentives and disincentives are important. One of the most important incentive structures is going to have to be a price on carbon. And this price on carbon is not straightforward. Different countries, people today say the right price on carbon should be $70, $80 a ton. The truth is most parts of the world cannot afford that kind of price of carbon. You have to shut the whole economy down. But you have to start somewhere. And so Singapore has started with a $5 price on carbon, but already indicated that we were going to ratchet it up in the coming years. Indonesia just announced a $2 price on carbon. And you would argue that this is very low, but eventually people have to get started. Now that's in the regulatory frame, it's the public sector frame. So how do you actually make sure that this price on carbon and the incentive structures are things that the private sector can work with collaboratively? That is important. The private sector, last thing, is the role to play in creating appropriate carbon markets. I'm convinced that in the long term, you will have to create carbon markets, carbon offsets and carbon credit markets. And that is something which COP26 actually took a good step on. They got some resolution on Article 6 of corresponding adjustments and the NCDs. I think has established a baseline on which we can actually build something which is a market-driven approach to this. And the private sector could play a role with that as well.
Yeah, so I think some great points. We need a glide path, right? It has to be a glide path. It has to be measurable. In our group itself, we try and do our bit of sustainability. We are into renewable energy, and I know thermal will exist, but we are trying to do our bit. And of course, all our manufacturing plants are extremely green and have a lot of sustainability factors to it. You spoke about carbon credits, and COP26 also spoke about it. What do you think, while you touched this briefly, but what do you think, how do businesses, and specifically, maybe in India and some of the other global businesses, but let's talk about India today, what role, what do businesses have to change in coming years to actually become sustainable, right? While you spoke about what public sector has to do, but how do we internalize this? And how do we create a glide path and start measuring?
Yeah, I mean, actually, frankly, for business, I actually think of this whole transition as a $1 trillion opportunity. You think about everything that is required in rethinking your business models and re-architecting the production functions, the factory systems, the distribution systems, the supply chain systems, the kind of products you create, catering for a more environmentally sensitive consumer, creating the right measurements and forecasts for consumers to relate to, you can completely reimagine your business model. And I'm convinced that the companies that take the first steps to doing that will reap the benefits of it at scale. Now, the actual steps you need to take obviously depend on the sector in which you are. If you're in the agri sector, this goes back to the nature of agri-farming. I think the entire agricultural construct can change very substantively in terms of, we talked about soil, fertilizer, using digital technologies, getting greater sustainability, rethinking the supply chain, etc. around agriculture. You take the mining sector, or you take the energy sector, you take the transportation sector. In each sector, you can see how shift to renewables, shift to less carbon-intensive business models, rethinking of the production systems as well as the distribution system can make a meaningful change. But as you correctly said, there needs to be a glide path. Nobody can afford the kind of investment that is required to junk your current business and start all over again. So you need to take it piece by piece. Where is it material? Where can you monetize it? Where do you get the best outcome? So let me tell you what I'm doing as a bank. I've got two prisms. One prism is what can I do more of? And the second prism is what do I need to do less of or help my customers to change? In the what do I need to do more of, I've got a target of doing $50 billion of more sustainable and green financing. And that includes the whole shebang. So, like we do solar, we do wind, we do geothermal. We have shifted our entire energy-related portfolio from vastly fossil-based now to predominantly renewables. And that's been a very conscious shift in our business strategy. It's paying rich dividends because that's where the future is and that's where I'm seeing the growth. But equally, I spoke to you, I've also done what I do less of. I've started scaling down some of my fossil fuels, and there I work with our clients. And so we work with them to say, okay, what can you do in 3 years? What can we do in 5 years? How can we help you make the shifts that you need to make by financing certain projects or financing certain changes that you need to make in your system? So there's one thing we do, what we do more of. But equally, the whole transition economics, we're today working in 8 sectors where we work with clients to understand what could you do to make your model from brown to less brown. The example I gave you is a great example. When the IMO last year said all of the ships which are using this dirty fuel, sulfur emission ships, they need to change. Well, we started working with all ship companies to in the first phase, how do we finance putting scrubbers on the ships? Because that's the best short-term solution. Eventually, the longer-term solution is how do I start financing ships which are actually more efficient than clean energy? But that can't be done overnight. So I can do step 1 and then I can do step 2. I think that mentality is what the private sector needs to follow in every sector. What can we do short-term? How do we monetize it? How do we go long-term? And like I said, finally, I think the consumer is changing. Without a doubt, in many sectors, the consumer is willing to pay a differentiated price if you can establish green provenance. So let me tell you another project we're doing with a rubber company here. We established a whole exchange which can go back and track provenance of rubber right from the estate to make sure it's green and sustainable rubber. And then we brand it. And once we brand it, it's quite clear that the tire companies are willing to pay a premium for it. And the reason they're willing to pay a premium is because the consumer is willing to pay a premium for these green tires. Now, that change, which allows you to change the whole ecosystem end to end, while still not compromising on profit and profitability, that is the kind of shift which individual sectors need to make and find the right solutions.
Absolutely. So I think not only it probably will enhance profitability, and like you said, it's a $1 trillion opportunity for the first movers kind of advantage. And I think a great example of the tires. I mean, people do start paying more for greener and more sustainable stuff. So Piyush, moving on to climate change, right? You mentioned in a couple of times you briefly mentioned it, but climate change could be the next big disaster. We face adding to the global humanitarian crisis and ongoing massive toll on the public health and human life. Global solutions is combined in a combined partnership model is the solution. How should countries continue on this path, of coordinated strategies in other areas such as public health, vaccine availability, health infrastructure, and how is this climate change impacting the globe, and how do we actually all come together on this?
Yeah. So, Abhimanyu, I think this is one of our big challenges. And I have to say, what you said is correct. The pandemic brought us all together. But at the same time, it didn't bring us together as much as we needed to come together. If you go back to the global financial crisis, the G20 got together and created a coordinated set of responses. And if you compare that with the degree of coordination we were able to get, whether WHO or through global measures, Covaxin, etc., this time around, it wasn't at the same level. And therefore, this is one of the 4 points that I think this really requires a degree of leadership which is substantively different. Now, you can argue there's a set of the United Nations institutions, there's the Bretton Woods institutions, which are an existing framework. You could argue either we need to overhaul those mechanisms, or we need to actually look at trying to create parallel sets of mechanisms around climate in particular. Some key things we need to get line of sight to, I refer to. One, measurements. So how do you get measurements? Now, the existing work, which is the new IFRS Foundation, the Sustainability Standard Board, might be a helpful step, but we need to make sure that the developing world, the countries in the South, are active participants in this process. Otherwise, what often happens is you come up with a global framework which suits some countries, partly because of the stage of economic development of where they are, and the other countries which need to have a voice don't have a sufficient voice. So we need to make sure that countries like India, like many of the southern countries, have an active voice in the frameworks that are being set up, particularly around measurement and taxonomy. Second, we need to actually make sure that we have much better coordination in terms of resource mobilization. If you go back to COP, right from the 93 Kyoto Protocol, I still remember Mr. Kamal Nath in those days used to be used to be television all the time. But the underlying issue was this, that we need to make sure there's adequate resource transfer from the north to the south. I actually think it's a bigger issue. If you look at the problem with the Gilets Jaunes, the French strikes earlier last year, when President Macron put a tax on fossil fuel, it became quite clear that the rich people were okay with it. It's the poor people who are getting hammered. So this is the truth, that this cost of transition will be borne unusually by developing countries, poorer countries, and poorer segments of the population, even in the rich countries. So we need to come together to make sure that we have a collective view on the resource support and the resource transfer that is needed to support this transition. How do we make it a just transition, not just a transition? That requires this global coordination. And therefore, to my mind, India has a really meaningful opportunity and role to either help shepherd a new set of discussions or play a more leading role in the frameworks that exist to be able to bring the countries and bring the right balance together. The good news is that there is a lot of interest. There is a lot of interest to be able to create a coalition of the willing and even create a coalition, a regional partnership coalition. Leveraging, you talked about digital tools, for example, in the region. So I think that things that can be done, but it requires a lot of energy and, it requires the big countries like India to be able to drive the process.
Great. So like, as you mentioned, India, let's, double click on India. So especially that India, given its announcement and commitment at COP26, what should India do to build a sustainable financial system? What sort of policies would global companies expect to explore green financing opportunities in India?
Well, the issue of green financing is on us. Frankly, there is a lot of green financing today. As you said, every fund you talk to has an ESG component. And, there's trillions of dollars wanting to find the right projects. So the answers really are around 2 or 3 things. Number one, you've got to be willing to let foreign capital come in debt form, portfolio money, debt form, etc., to be able to do this thing. But then you have to be able to find the right projects for them to do. So the problem sometimes is not finding the money. The problem sometimes is finding the bankable projects and making sure that there is a way to measure the greenness of the project. And it goes back to the earlier discussion I had. So I think one is an element of that. The second is blended finance. I think some of this stuff has got to be catalyzed by government participation. So, some of these have long lead time projects. Sometimes you need to figure, there's, in the past, the element of subsidy. And frankly, in some cases, you still need that. If you look at solar and wind, there was a large element of subsidy in that in early years and then disappeared because the market could then bear it. So I think some of the financing arrangements might have to have some degree of blended finance, where there's an element of government support schemes and mechanisms to be able to provide support. One way you could create an incentive structure is just the way you think about capital. If we all genuinely believe that sustainable projects are less risky in the long term because you're less likely to have transition risk or physical risk, then theoretically they should be less capital consuming. And so a simple thing you could do is to change the capital adequacy norm for projects which are categorized as ESG and green. And if you do that, then you'll be able to lower the cost of capital for these kinds of projects. So these are some very specific things that governments and the central banks, along with the private sector, can do to crowd some of this financing that you're talking about into the kind of projects that matter.
I think it's a great idea to, adjust capital adequacy norms basis the green, basis the financing that they're doing. And yeah, a lot of money is sitting there. Funds are sitting there with to invest in ESG compliant businesses. But again, like we mentioned, there has to be a glide path to really comply with those ESG compliance, because it's evolving in India. It's still pretty new in India.
So back to the transition finance, I think which is why, along with the government, so in some countries, Netherlands is a good example, where the government led a good effort along with the private sector, some sectors, to agree on what is a likely and acceptable glide path. There are many glide paths. The IEA has its own glide path. The Network for Green, the financing system has their own glide path. If the country agrees and say, hey, in our context, in this industry, this is an acceptable glide path that gets us from A to B, that creates the confidence among financiers saying, okay, I can do these projects because they're consistent with that glide path. Right? In the absence of that, people say, if I do this project, I might get criticized. But once it is aligned to a transition pathway, it becomes easier for the money to be able to actually support it.
Great. So we'll move to the next discussion on MSMEs. Right? MSMEs are a backbone of global value chains. However, given the sudden shift of digitization, they are playing catch up and are also struggling to adapt to the evolving situation. How is DBS as a global bank supporting MSMEs to recover? What are the 3 things governments and business should focus on to make MSMEs more resilient?
Yeah, so I guess, the first is, I think India did as well. Certainly most of the countries in which we operate, people figured we had to buy time. And the way to buy time was effectively to create liquidity support for MSMEs. Because unlike large companies like your group who got alternative mechanisms, MSMEs have a single source of cash flow, and it's very easy for them to fall off the cliff. So DBS was actively involved. In fact, we came up with our own programs to put loans into moratorium, to cut back and defer prepayments or repayments. And then, frankly, all the government stepped in. So we got a lot of government-supported programs. We actually put out almost $20 billion through these moratoriums, extended loans up to 3-5 years, just to create resiliency and help people with the short-term impact on cash flows. Now, this is, of course, only stuff you can do in the short term. You cannot perpetuate this forever, but it certainly helps to buy some degree of time. The second big thing is the digital transformation. We talked about digital consumption. Frankly, MSMEs have a tremendous opportunity to actually broaden the market footprint meaningfully. Today, if you're an MSME sitting in Delhi or sitting in Mumbai, your marketplace is limited. The best you can do is to go around Mumbai, if you're lucky, Maharashtra, but perhaps not even that. That if you are able to capture the digital consumption economy, you can actually start broad-basing what you do. I spoke to some of our clients in Thane a couple of months ago, and their view is partly GST they were thanking, but more importantly, the fact that they could convert digitally means they could start actually accessing consumers and customers outside. This idea that MSMEs can play a role in a larger marketplace, this is one thing that we need to keep pushing. You have to have the logistics support, but the truth is today, Amazon and Walmart of the world have shown that you can get global logistics support. You need to get the marketing support. One thing governments can do is to create the right portals and platforms for some of these MSMEs to showcase themselves. and sometimes even outside the country. A lot of the work we've done in Singapore is to help the MSMEs here showcase their products into the region, into Southeast Asia and ASEAN. So MSMEs are no longer limited to the domestic Singapore market. They're beginning to go out into the regional markets. So helping MSMEs digitize to explore some of that stuff is second. Now, this is not easy because obviously they don't have the skill sets. They oftentimes don't have the people. So sometimes you need to put in place the capacity building programs, the reskilling as well as the financial programs to be able to make this happen. And that's something that we could continue to scale up in India to be able to achieve that. A last thing to me is really to try and create this digitizing supply chains and ecosystems. Frankly, one of the things that most people realized with the 2-year pandemic is the lack of transparency in the supply chain. Most of the people who are buying from China, I can tell you, they all knew who the first level supplier was. But the fact that the first level supplier had a second level and a third level and a fourth level supplier, they didn't have transparency to it. And so when things came to a point, nobody knew where the bottlenecks were and what was happening. So to try and create a supply chain visibility, to digitize that end-to-end supply chain, I think that could be really helpful. And I referred to it in my earlier comments, and I was reading somewhere about the national logistics platform that we're trying to create in India. I work with a small company called Odex, which has got the whole port to land digitization on the east coast of India. I think bringing the MSMEs into the digitized supply chains when they have transparency and led by some large anchors, I think that could create some momentum as well.
Yeah, I think there are platforms like GEMS and stuff which is actually trying to digitize some of this, as well as India Stack was trying to do a lot of flow-based lending, right? Which and I think initiatives like GST and data asymmetry actually getting more and more narrower, it really helps for bankers and lenders to provide that loans at basically the digital infrastructure. But couldn't agree more in terms of scale. And I think as an industry, we have to be responsible to really get them out of that box to show that digital savviness will actually give them a much bigger geography than just a Thane like you mentioned.
And everybody used to pick up in your point, this too. So we're already seeing today, till 5 years ago, all our MSME lending was traditional. I was basing it on the balance sheet, collateral, and backward-looking view of their statement. And the truth is, for many MSMEs, you can't even rely on the statement. There are 3 sets of books. Today, you can underwrite them very differently. You can underwrite them on transactional flow data. And by doing that, you can actually start providing liquidity and financing to MSMEs who you would not be able to finance in the past. So I think the digital stuff, data-driven, in fact, AI, ML model-driven, that's a reality.
Absolutely. So we are running out of time. I'll ask you a last quick question. I had multiple stuff to ask you, but I think we've had a very interesting conversation. And since we're talking about digital and financing basis data analytics and ML, startups have emerged as innovative game changers, right? They have changed the game. What should companies do to encourage, nurture their growth and development in the path towards this recovery? And how should companies use these startups, as either partners or invest or whatever your views are and what DBS is doing? And then we can conclude.
So, Abhimanyu, my view is that 1% of startups will scale to be able to build their own customer base. And that's because the cost of customer acquisition, even in the digital world, is actually quite high. 99% of startups, therefore, will not be able to make it because they can't get the customer footprint. However, these 99% of startups all have good ideas. They have reimagined how work can be done. They've reimagined a value proposition and product proposition. So the best way is for companies like yours and mine to work with these 99% of startups and see how we can capture the value proposition, the new way of working they've created, and make it a part of our own product offering. I think that brings value all around. It gives them a ready B2B kind of business model where they can work with the large companies. It gives us capacity to change our own offering by relying on a startup and the ideas. And it allows us collectively to go to market to improve the customer experience and improve the customer value proposition. I think that's a win-win all around. And that's a model that we've been using at DBS. A large part of the digital offerings we take to the market, we actually put together by working with many startups and making sure that we can create a comprehensive product solution, which is better than the sum of the parts.
Great. I think that's music to my ears, because this is what we do at our group and Hero FinCorp. We believe partnerships is the only way to go, and really partner with the new age startups to help provide a better customer service and a better offering to the customer, as well as to create sort of some champion challenger within the organization. But thank you, Piyush. I think it's been a very interesting conversation, and thank you for your time, and look forward to more engagements with CII in the future.
I look forward to it. I've enjoyed chatting with you, and my best wishes to CII and frankly the whole forum as you go forward.
Yeah. Thank you to all the audience. I think we've had a very large audience viewing us, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you and namaskar.
Yes.